Good morning. Good morning. Thank you. I was a president of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty recently in 2007 to 2011. But I got to know this part of Europe as a young American in the 1980s. I was probably a rarity, but as a young American, I traveled to Eastern Europe between 1979 and 1989, maybe, I don't know, 25, 30 times, virtually everywhere. I had this insatiable appetite about what was happening in this part of the continent. I was reminded coming down from my room this morning, in those days, as you well know, you learn so much from stories. And I was reminded of a story that I heard in the late 1980s from friends of mine in East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, where there is a young East German, let's say his name is Fritz, Hans, I don't know, who gets a phone call one day with very good news because this local Communist Party apparatchik is ringing him to notify him that he's going to get an automobile. And as you recall, in East Germany, in the GDR in those days, an automobile was a Trabant, a Trabi, which was a plastic-bodied, 26-horsepower lawnmower, basically, with 4 wheels. So this gentleman gets a phone call from this local official. The waiting time could be 7, 8, 9 years, astonishingly enough. And he's told, come by the office on Tuesday. Good news, after your wait of 8 years, you're going to get a Trabi. You're going to get your automobile. So this young German scurries down to the office Tuesday at 4 o'clock dutifully, shows up and says, I'm here. I've waited. Where's my car? And the official says, no. It was my intention to tell you, you've been approved to get your car, but you don't get the car today. And so the young East German, a little bit deflated, says, I've been approved after 8 years. Well, when do I get my car? And it's like this, and beautiful autumn day, September, and the official says, well, the good news, because of the precision of scientific socialistic planning, we can tell you it's in December. And young East German says, okay, 4 more months. Can you tell me when in December? And the guy says, well, actually, yes, December 10th. And then the young East German says, can you tell me what time of day? And the communist official says, well, what possible difference does it make? I'm telling you you're getting it. I'm telling you in 4 months. I'm telling you on December 10th. Why does it matter what time of day? And this young East German says, well, on the December 10th, I have the plumber coming in the morning, which is another way of saying that, and you know this and live this, lots has changed in a quarter of a century in this part of Europe. And from an American perspective, having experienced life then and experienced what's been happening the last 2.5 decades, the economic transformation has been nothing but spectacular in each and every way. And it's affected lifestyle, and it's affected standard of living, and it's affected infrastructure and environment, and it's been uniformly positive and healthy, no matter what the challenges are today. But needless to say, and as you've heard from other speakers this morning, the geostrategic situation is now suddenly troubling again. And now what we thought was a completed or near completed project in the 1990s, which we referred to as Europe whole and free, that's in jeopardy. Relations with Russia are in crisis. There's war actually in Ukraine. And if you travel around this region, as I do, and many of you do frequently, there's considerable anxiety in a number of capitals about additional aggression and additional destabilization. What I'd like to do in the next couple minutes is make 3 points from my perspective about American foreign policy. You'll be hearing during the course of today from 2 other fellow Americans, Josh Walker, my friend and colleague Sally Painter, and our views may be differing or different, but I'm going to share with you my views of what's happening with American foreign policy as we think about this part of the world. 3 points. The first point, we have had over the last 15 years 2 shifts away from Europe, whether they're good reasons or not. After 9/11, under President Bush, we had a significant reallocation of resources and attention to the so-called war on terror, and then under President Obama, a so-called pivot to Asia. I think in Washington foreign policy circles that is beginning to change now. It doesn't diminish at all the strategic importance of East Asia or the subcontinent or the greater Middle East, but I think that we have learned that Europe is not complete, history has not ended, and American interest is still very valid and present in this part of the world. I think that there has been a sobering on, as we say, both sides of the aisle about our relationship with Russia. Martin, you said that there's no place in foreign policy for ideology, and I fully agree. And I think no matter who the next president is, Democrat or Republican next year, foreign policy toward Russia will be guided by pragmatism and realism. Maybe not the kind that all of you want, but nevertheless, I think pragmatism and realism, because I think Democrats and Republicans have become chastened and feel sobered about our own experiments from our point of view. 2008 in Bucharest, it was the idea that if we joined Europeans and did not push for a path to NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia, that would engender better relations with Russia. And we tested that thesis, and about 4 months later, Russian tanks were, as they say in German, about a Panzerstunde, an hour away by tank, outside of Tbilisi. That was a disappointing experiment for Americans. I think under President Obama, there was a interesting thesis about reset, and it needed substance. It needed flesh on the bones. And so President Obama said, well, look, we're going to cancel missile defense with Poland and the Czech Republic because Russia doesn't want it. It will antagonize Russia. It will give Russia a feeling of insecurity, and we want cooperation and collaboration. And alas, while it riled our friends in Prague and in Warsaw, it did not engender kinder and gentler behavior from the Kremlin and from Moscow. Then came Crimea, where many Americans of both conservative and liberal stripe said, this is highly regrettable. This is highly disappointing. But you know what? Be realistic and understand history and culture. Crimea is special. Crimea is unique. And so it is. Annexation, disappointing. But Russia would never, ever dare to sponsor wider war in Ukraine. They wouldn't dare such a provocation. Well, history is a sobering thing. I think that the first point I reiterate is that I think the new American administration, whether Democrat or Republican, will give greater attention to Europe and will have a far more pragmatic, realistic view of what's possible in the bilateral relationship with Russia. The second point has to do with Ukraine itself. I think it's a conventional wisdom, and I think it's a turn of phrase used by the German Chancellor Merkel, that there is no military solution to Ukraine. That's one of those yes, but observations. I would say that there's no solution without a military dimension. I would say that you cannot formulate a strategy and tactics unless you're mindful of the strategy and tactics of your opponent. I would say that soft power has primacy, but it never works without hard power. And if you're giving an interview, ask that to Vladimir Putin and see what he thinks. See if he thinks that soft power can work without hard power. So my second point is, I think that the United States and both parties are committed to a diplomatic solution, but I think a new administration will probably be impatient to wait for Minsk 6 and Minsk 9 and Minsk 11, and will probably forge a more multifaceted, robust policy, including helping Ukrainians defend themselves through arms and training. The third point, and the last point I make, has to do with the critical relationship between the United States and the European Union. It is not what it used to be during the Cold War. We've changed. Europe has changed. There's no longer a West German junior partner. Germany is united and plays an important, influential role in the continent and beyond. But I think both sides of the equation face a very difficult moment and a very serious challenge. In the United States, we see a period where partisanship, which is a healthy part of any democracy, is evolving to a very dangerous polarization, in my view. I think democracy, which we all cherish and is so noble, is giving way in some quarters to populism and demagoguery. I think in the United States, and we see it early on in the election campaign, celebrity, which we just seem to value, it's just fun, it's entertaining, is obscuring what the hour actually requires. And what we Americans need is statesmen, not salesmen. So if you're watching the American election campaign and you're seeing Donald Trump on the newswaves, I can only say, in my view, with some hope, remember that quote by Churchill, who said that the Americans always end up with the right conclusion, but after first always exploring all the other available options. I think that's part of our process. I think in Europe, from my perspective, the moment is no less challenging, because while the symptoms and the items that drive the news of the day, Greece and bailouts, refugees and migration, are terribly important, I think there are signs, challenges, threats that the European project as currently conceived is pulling apart. And I don't think that's in America's interest, and I don't think it's in Europe's interest, but there will be a referendum in Britain in 2017. There is restive segments of the German population who understandably are fed up with bailouts. Ironically and sadly, my Greek friends have never disliked Germans more, who have never been more generous to Greece, and so on and so forth. I think both sides have immense challenges the next couple or few years. Both sides have to work very closely together and listen very attentively to one another. And I think, above all, trite though it may sound, and I don't mean to conclude with conference speak, but it's important to remember that Americans and Europeans are bound together by interests, but as always in the past, by values that we take for granted, but we must fight for and defend. Rule of law, democracy and human rights, pluralism, tolerance, and respect for diversity. These are things that are precious. These are things that were fought for in the past, and these are things that can disappear. So on that note, I congratulate and thank the organizers. I think fora like these are absolutely important and indispensable, and it's important to come to listen, to learn, to have an open mind, but also, as we Americans say, always have an open mind, but not so open that your brains fall out. I'll stop with that. Thank you.